August 15, 1945. Victory over Japan Day. Across America, sirens wailed and confetti filled the streets in wild celebration. In prisoner of war camps from California to Texas, Japanese soldiers prepared for repatriation to their defeated homeland. But in a small facility outside Camp Florence, Arizona, something unprecedented was happening. When American commanders announced to a group of Japanese women prisoners that they were free to return home, many of them did the unthinkable. They begged to stay. These weren't ordinary prisoners. They were members of the Japanese Women's Auxiliary Service, captured during the final months of the war in the Pacific. Young women who had served the empire in various capacities, now facing a choice that would define the rest of their lives. What could possibly make someone choose to remain in enemy captivity rather than return to freedom in their own country? Before we discover what happened to these remarkable women, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. The story begins 8 months earlier in December 1944, when the first group of Japanese women prisoners arrived at the makeshift facility. Unlike male POW camps, this smaller compound housed fewer than 50 women, ranging in age from 18 to 35. They had been captured in the Philippines and Okinawa as Japanese forces retreated, serving as nurses, radio operators, and administrative personnel for the Imperial Army. Captain Rebecca Holland, one of the few female officers assigned to oversee the facility, remembered her first encounter with the prisoners. The women stepped off the transport truck with a mixture of defiance and fear in their eyes. They wore remnants of their olive green auxiliary uniforms, some still bearing the chrysanthemum insignia they had once worn with pride. Among them was 24-year-old Haruko Sato, a former military nurse from Osaka. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Service in 1943, believing she was serving her emperor's divine mission. Now standing in an American prison camp, she clutched a small silk pouch that contained the only remaining connection to her previous life, a photograph of her family standing outside their home in Osaka. The photograph showed her parents, her 2 younger brothers, and her grandmother, all smiling on a spring day that now felt like it belonged to another lifetime. The first weeks were tense and filled with uncertainty. The Japanese women kept to themselves, speaking only in hushed Japanese conversations during mealtimes. They followed camp routines mechanically, their faces masks of resigned dignity mixed with barely concealed shame at having been captured alive, a dishonor in their culture that weighed heavier than any physical chains. Captain Holland watched them carefully during those early days, noting how they moved with precision and discipline, how they maintained their composure even when fear flickered in their eyes, and how they seemed to expect treatment far harsher than anything the Americans had planned for them. Captain Holland noticed how the Japanese women maintained rigid military bearing even in captivity, bowing to guards and standing straighter than many of her own soldiers. They refused to make eye contact with their captors, a cultural practice that the American staff initially mistook for defiance rather than respect. The women ate their meals in complete silence, their movements precise and controlled, as if any deviation from perfect discipline might bring terrible consequences. But something began to change as the harsh Arizona winter settled over the desert camp. The temperature dropped dramatically at night, and the thin barracks walls did little to keep out the cold wind that swept across the high desert. It started with small gestures from the American guards and staff. Private Daniel Martinez, a young man from a farming family in New Mexico, noticed that one of the Japanese women, a petite figure named Michiko Nakamura, appeared to be fighting off a persistent cough in the cold December nights. Her shoulders shook with suppressed coughing during evening roll call, and she wrapped her arms around herself in a futile attempt to stay warm. Without asking permission, he brought her an extra wool blanket and a cup of hot tea made from herbs his grandmother had taught him about. The tea smelled of chamomile and mint, steam rising in the cold air. Michiko looked at him with surprise, her dark eyes reflecting confusion at this unexpected kindness. She had been taught that American soldiers were ruthless demons who showed no mercy to their enemies. Yet here was this young man, barely older than her own younger brother back in Tokyo, showing concern for her well-being. She accepted the tea with a quiet bow, her hands trembling slightly as she wrapped them around the warm cup, and for the first time since her capture, her rigid posture softened slightly. Word of such small kindnesses spread through the compound like whispers carried on the wind. Sergeant James Chen, whose parents had immigrated from China decades earlier, understood what it meant to be seen as different, as foreign, as the enemy. He began teaching basic English phrases to any prisoner who showed interest, using hand gestures and drawings when words failed. His presence was complicated. A Chinese-American teaching Japanese prisoners the language of their captors, but he approached his duty with patience and unexpected compassion that seemed to transcend the brutal history between their nations. Haruko found herself drawn to these impromptu lessons. She had studied some English in school before the war and discovered she had an aptitude for languages. More importantly, she began to see something in the Americans' faces that contradicted everything she had been told about them. Instead of hatred, she saw curiosity. Instead of the cruelty she had been warned about, she witnessed unexpected moments of humanity that made no sense according to her training. Fumiko Watanabe, at 27, the oldest of the main group, watched these interactions with deep suspicion. She had served as an administrative clerk in Kyoto, managing supply records for military hospitals. Fumiko had seen the propaganda posters, read the military newsletters describing American savagery and their treatment of prisoners. These acts of kindness must be tricks, she told the others in whispered Japanese conversations after lights out. They want us to lower our guard, to betray information about our homeland, to make us weak and compliant. But as the days turned into weeks, even Fumiko's certainty began to crack under the weight of accumulated small mercies. The Americans didn't interrogate them harshly. They didn't starve them or beat them. Instead, they provided adequate housing, medical care, and daily routines that, while monotonous, were far less brutal than what they had been prepared to endure based on their military training about capture. The turning point came on a particularly bitter December morning when temperatures dropped below freezing overnight. Haruko woke to find frost covering the inside of the barracks windows, her breath visible in the cold air. During morning assembly, several of the women were visibly shivering, their thin auxiliary uniforms providing inadequate protection against the Arizona winter cold. Private Martinez noticed their distress and spoke quietly to Captain Holland. Within an hour, the guards distributed heavy wool coats to every prisoner, American military surplus that was far warmer than anything they had worn before. The women accepted the coats with confusion and gratitude, uncertain how to process this continued pattern of unexpected care from their supposed enemies. That afternoon, Michiko approached Sergeant Chen during one of his English lessons with a question that had been building in her mind for weeks. She spoke in halting, carefully pronounced English that she had been practicing in secret. "Why you kind to us? We are enemy. We are your enemy." Sergeant Chen paused, considering his response carefully. He looked at the young woman standing before him, barely 21 years old, far from home, and clearly struggling to understand a reality that contradicted everything she had been taught. "Because you're human beings first," he said simply. "War doesn't change that." The concept seemed to shake something loose in Michiko's understanding of the world. She had been raised to believe that enemies were fundamentally different, that Americans lacked the moral character and honor that defined Japanese culture. Yet here she was, being treated with more dignity and compassion than she had sometimes experienced in her own military service. That evening, Haruko wrote in a small notebook she had been given by Captain Holland, one of the few personal items the prisoners were permitted. She wrote in Japanese, the characters flowing across the page as she tried to make sense of her confusion. "We were told Americans were monsters," she wrote. But they give us warm coats when we are cold. They bring tea when we are sick. They teach us their language with patience. What kind of monsters do these things? What does it mean if everything we believed was wrong? The question would haunt her for weeks to come. Christmas of 1944 approached with a tension that hung over the camp like the cold desert fog that rolled in at dawn. Captain Holland had wrestled with how to handle the holiday, knowing that many of her Japanese prisoners were likely homesick and struggling with depression as the reality of their separation from families and homeland settled into their bones. She decided to organize a modest celebration, allowing the camp kitchen to prepare something special for the day. What happened next would become the defining moment that transformed the relationship between captors and prisoners forever. On Christmas morning, the camp cooks prepared massive pots of hot beef stew, rich with tender chunks of meat, carrots, potatoes, onions, and peas swimming in thick, savory gravy. The aroma filled the compound as the women lined up for their midday meal, uncertain what to expect. When Haruko reached the serving line and looked down at the generous portion being ladled into her bowl, her hands began to tremble. She had not seen this much meat in a single meal in over 2 years. During her service in the Philippines, rations had been meager and growing worse as supply lines collapsed. Rice with thin miso soup and occasional vegetables had been the standard fare. Meat was a luxury reserved for officers, and even then, in quantities smaller than what now sat steaming in her bowl. Machiko stood beside her, staring at her own portion with wide eyes. Behind them, other women whispered in Japanese, their voices filled with disbelief. "This must be a mistake," one woman said. "Surely this is meant for the American soldiers. They will take it back when they realize." But no one took the stew back. Instead, Private Martinez smiled and gestured toward the tables. "Merry Christmas," he said in his limited Japanese, the phrase carefully practiced. The women sat down with their bowls, still uncertain, still waiting for someone to announce the error. Fumiko was the first to taste the stew. She lifted a spoonful to her lips cautiously, then closed her eyes as the rich, warm flavors flooded her mouth. The meat was tender and seasoned with herbs she didn't recognize. The vegetables were soft and sweet. The gravy was thick and satisfying in a way that made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. Around her, other women began to eat, and what happened next shocked the American guards who were watching. Several of the women began to cry as they ate, tears streaming down their faces as they consumed the stew with an intensity that spoke of months or years of deprivation. Some ate so quickly they had to pause to catch their breath. Others ate slowly, savoring every single bite as if trying to memorize the taste. Haruko found herself crying too, unable to stop the tears even as she continued eating. The sight of Japanese women crying over bowls of beef stew had shaken something loose in the American guards. Private Martinez later wrote to his mother that he had never fully understood what hunger meant until he saw those women eat that Christmas meal. They weren't just hungry for food, he wrote. They were hungry for kindness, for proof that the world still had goodness in it. That evening, as the winter sun set over the Arizona desert, Captain Holland had arranged for a small Christmas tree to be placed in the main hall. It was decorated with simple paper ornaments that some of the American staff had made, along with strings of popcorn and a few precious glass bulbs that had been donated by a local church. The women were invited to gather for what the captain described as a holiday observance, though she kept expectations modest. What she didn't expect was for Haruko to approach her before the gathering began. The young nurse stood with her hands clasped in front of her, speaking in careful, halting English that had improved remarkably over the past weeks. "Captain Holland," Haruko began, her voice soft but determined. "May we sing for you? Japanese songs, Christmas songs. We want to share something. We want to give back." Captain Holland felt her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. "Of course," she said. "We would be honored." That evening, 47 Japanese women stood before their American captors in the decorated hall. They had spent the afternoon teaching each other songs, the younger women who knew some English helping the others with pronunciation. They began with a traditional Japanese winter song, their voices blending in harmonious precision that spoke of their musical training. The melody was haunting and beautiful, rising and falling like wind through pine trees. Even though none of the Americans understood the words, the emotion was clear. It was a song about home, about longing, about the beauty of snow falling on distant mountains. When they finished, there was a moment of profound silence. Then they began to sing Silent Night in English. Their pronunciation was imperfect, the consonants sometimes wrong, but their intention was unmistakable. They had practiced this for hours, wanting to offer something to the people who had shown them unexpected mercy. Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright. Private Martinez found tears streaming down his face. Sergeant Chen stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his usual stoic expression cracking. Even the hardened veterans among the guards felt something shift in their hearts as they listened to enemy soldiers singing about peace on earth. When the song ended, Captain Holland began to clap, and soon the entire room erupted in applause. The Japanese women bowed deeply, their faces flushed with emotion. For the first time since their arrival, they smiled, not the polite, controlled smiles of prisoners trying to please their captors, but genuine expressions of joy and connection that transcended language and nationality and war itself. The Christmas celebration had marked a turning point in the camp's atmosphere. Conversations between guards and prisoners became more frequent and more genuine. The Japanese women began to volunteer for additional work duties, not out of obligation, but from what appeared to be sincere desire to contribute. They helped in the kitchen, mended uniforms, and those with medical training like Haruko assisted the camp nurse with daily sick calls. Haruko found herself becoming an unofficial translator and mediator between the two groups. Her English improved rapidly, and she began to serve as a bridge between cultures that had been taught to hate each other. She discovered that many of the American soldiers were just as homesick as the Japanese prisoners, just as uncertain about what the future would bring. By February 1945, the dynamics in the camp had shifted dramatically. The Japanese women no longer sat apart during meals. Conversations in mixed English and Japanese could be heard throughout the compound. Sergeant Chen had organized informal classes where prisoners taught Japanese phrases while learning more English in return. Michiko had begun helping Private Martinez learn basic Japanese, their lessons filled with laughter at mispronunciations and cultural misunderstandings. But it was the arrival of devastating news from Japan that truly changed everything. As American forces advanced closer to the Japanese mainland, reports began filtering back about the massive firebombing campaigns over Tokyo and other cities. Stories of entire neighborhoods consumed by flames, of tens of thousands dead, of a level of destruction that most of the prisoners could barely comprehend. Haruko sat in the camp's small library, reading American newspapers with growing horror and despair. The images showed Tokyo in ruins, whole city blocks reduced to ash. Her hands trembled as she read accounts of the March 9th firebombing that had killed over 100,000 civilians in a single night. Osaka, her hometown, had been hit repeatedly. She had no way of knowing if her family had survived. Michiko found her there, tears streaming down her face as she stared at photographs of burning cities. "Haruko?" she whispered in Japanese, her voice breaking. "My mother and sisters were in Tokyo, the Asakusa district. That's where they lived." The newspaper said Asakusa was completely destroyed. Other women gathered around the newspapers, their faces reflecting the same shock and anguish. These were not hardened soldiers who had seen combat, but young women who had served in support roles, believing they were defending their homeland from invasion. Now they were confronting the reality that their homeland was being systematically destroyed while they sat safe in an American prison camp eating beef stew, and learning English. That night, the sound of quiet sobbing echoed through the barracks. Captain Holland walked through the compound, hearing the grief of women who had just learned they might have nothing and no one to return to. The war that had brought them here was now consuming everything they had left behind. Spring of 1945 brought news that shook the world and devastated the Japanese prisoners at Camp Florence. On August 6th, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another fell on Nagasaki. The scale of destruction was beyond anything humanity had ever witnessed. Entire cities vaporized in seconds, tens of thousands dead instantly, with countless more dying slowly from radiation sickness that no one fully understood. For the women in the camp, the news brought a paralyzing mixture of horror, guilt, and profound confusion about their place in a world that had changed so completely. Haruko spent 3 days barely eating or speaking after the news arrived. She sat in the library reading every newspaper article she could find, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what had happened. On August 15th, Japan surrendered unconditionally. Emperor Hirohito's voice, heard by his subjects for the first time ever through radio broadcasts, announced that the war had ended. For the Japanese women prisoners, this moment should have brought relief. The war was over. They would be going home. But as they sat together in the main hall, listening to Captain Holland explain the repatriation procedures that would begin soon, many of them felt only dread. What did home even mean anymore? Reports from Japan painted a picture of complete devastation. Cities lay in ruins. Families were scattered, displaced, or dead. The infrastructure that had sustained daily life had been destroyed. Food was scarce. The economy had collapsed. The country they had once known no longer existed in any recognizable form. Many of the women had lost contact with their families months or even years earlier. They had no way of knowing who, if anyone, was waiting for their return. Michiko had received one letter through the Red Cross in April, written by a neighbor in Tokyo. The letter informed her that her mother and 2 younger sisters had died in the March firebombing. Her father's whereabouts were unknown. The house where she had grown up no longer existed. She would be returning to nothing but ash and memories. Fumiko's situation was even more uncertain. She had received no word from Kyoto at all. Her parents would be in their 60s now if they had survived. Her brother had been conscripted into the army in 1943 and had not been heard from since. Meanwhile, their daily life in the American camp had evolved into something none of them had expected. What had begun as captivity had transformed into something approaching community. The American staff no longer treated them as enemy prisoners, but as displaced persons caught in circumstances beyond their control. Haruko had been corresponding with a local family, the Mitchells, who had begun visiting the camp as part of a church outreach program. Mrs. Mitchell, a librarian in Florence, had been impressed by Haruko's intelligence and her rapid mastery of English. More importantly, she had been moved by the young woman's genuine remorse about the war. "You're not responsible for decisions made by emperors and generals," Mrs. Mitchell had told her. "The question is what kind of person you choose to become now." But forgiveness from Americans was one thing. The women knew they would face a very different reception if they returned to Japan. They would be seen as failures, as soldiers who had been captured and corrupted by enemy influence. In Japanese culture, surrender and capture brought profound shame, not just to the individual, but to their entire family. Worse, they would return to a country that no longer reflected the world they had left behind. Everything they had believed in, everything they had been taught about their nation's divine mission had been shattered by defeat and the horrifying revelations about the war's true nature. As the official announcement of their impending repatriation approached, the conversations among the Japanese women grew more intense, more desperate, and more honest than they had ever been. They had found something in this American prison camp that many of them had never experienced before, even in their own country. They had found acceptance without judgment, purpose without propaganda, and the possibility of redemption without shame. They had found dignity in their work, respect in their interactions, and hope for a future that wasn't defined by the past. The morning of August 22, 1945 arrived with unusual tension, crackling through the camp like electricity before a desert storm. Captain Holland had called a general assembly for all Japanese prisoners to announce the official repatriation procedures. The 47 women gathered in the main hall, their faces reflecting months of internal struggle about what this moment would mean for their futures. Some looked relieved, ready to return home regardless of what awaited them. Others looked terrified, their eyes betraying the impossible choice they were facing. Captain Holland stood before them, holding official documents from the War Department. Her voice was steady but compassionate as she began to speak, aware that her words would change these women's lives forever. Ladies, I have received orders regarding your repatriation to Japan. Transportation will be arranged within the next 3 weeks. You will be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to your homes or to wherever you can find family members who survived the war. She paused, observing the mixture of relief and anxiety on their faces, the way some women gripped each other's hands for support. What she didn't expect was what happened next, a moment that would be recorded in military history as unprecedented. Haruko Sato stood up slowly, her hands visibly shaking, her face pale but determined. In clear, careful English that reflected months of practice and preparation, she addressed the captain directly. "Captain Holland, may I speak for some of us?" The request itself was bold, a prisoner asking permission to address her captor in front of the entire assembly. Captain Holland felt her heart rate quicken, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Permission granted, Haruko. Haruko looked around at her fellow prisoners, meeting the eyes of Michiko, Fumiko, and 11 other women who stood up to join her. They formed a small group within the larger assembly, their decision clearly made after countless hours of agonizing discussion. Haruko took a deep breath and spoke the words that would change everything. "We have been talking among ourselves for many weeks, Captain. Some of us, many of us, do not wish to return to Japan immediately. We wish to stay here." The words hung in the air like an impossible dream. Several American guards exchanged shocked, confused glances, unable to process what they had just heard. The silence that followed Haruko's statement was deafening. Captain Holland stood frozen, her official documents forgotten in her hands. In all her military experience, spanning over 15 years of service, she had never encountered prisoners of war requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom and repatriation to their homeland. It contradicted every regulation, every precedent, every assumption about what prisoners wanted. She asked for clarification, her voice uncertain. What followed was an outpouring of emotion that revealed the depth of transformation these women had undergone during their 9 months in American captivity. Haruko explained, her English flowing more confidently now, despite the tears streaming down her face, that they had written to the International Red Cross trying to locate their families. Of the 14 women who wished to stay, only 3 had received any news from home. 2 had learned that their entire families were dead, killed in bombing raids. The others faced complete uncertainty about whether anyone they loved had survived the war. More than that, they had found something in the American camp that they feared losing if they returned. "Here," Haruko continued, her voice breaking with emotion, "we have learned what it means to be treated with dignity, even as enemies. We have seen kindness where we expected cruelty. We have been given the chance to work, to contribute, to become better people than we were when we arrived. In Japan, we will be seen as failures, as women who dishonored their families by being captured. Here, we have found hope." Michiko spoke next in halting but determined English. "My family is gone. Tokyo is destroyed. What do I return to? Here I have found new family. Here I have purpose." Captain Holland, we know this is an unusual request, but we are asking for chance to build new lives." The implications of their request were staggering and unprecedented. Legally, they were still enemy prisoners of war. The Geneva Convention provided clear procedures for their repatriation, not for extended residence in the United States. Immigration laws were strict, and the idea of allowing former enemy soldiers to remain on American soil would be controversial at best, potentially explosive politically. But their emotional appeal touched something deeper than legal procedures or political considerations. Private Martinez, who had shown Michiko that first act of kindness with the blanket and tea months earlier, approached Captain Holland after the assembly. His face was flushed with emotion as he spoke. "Ma'am," he said quietly, aware that he was speaking far outside his rank and authority, "maybe I'm out of line here, but these women aren't our enemies anymore. They haven't been for months. They're just people who got caught up in something bigger than they understood, just like most of us. Sending them back to nothing, to a country that will shame them for being captured, seems wrong. It seems like we'd be punishing them for choosing to see us as human beings." Sergeant Chen added his voice to the discussion. "Captain, I've spent months teaching these women English, talking with them, learning about their lives before the war. They're not ideologues. They're not fanatics. They're young women who were told lies about what they were fighting for. And when they discovered the truth, they chose to change. Isn't that exactly what we want? Isn't that what America is supposed to represent?" That evening, Captain Holland sent an urgent telegram to her superiors in Washington describing the unprecedented situation unfolding at Camp Florence. The response would take days to arrive, leaving everyone in a strange state of limbo. The women who had chosen to stay continued their daily routines, but with a new intensity, as if trying to prove their worthiness for the remarkable request they had made. The debate reached beyond the military chain of command. Newspapers across the country picked up the story with headlines ranging from "Japanese prisoners refuse freedom" to "Enemy women choose America over homeland." The story became a symbol of larger questions about justice, forgiveness, and the possibility of human transformation in the aftermath of total war. After 2 weeks of bureaucratic deliberation, the War Department's response arrived. It was characteristically cautious, but unexpectedly flexible. The women would no longer be classified as prisoners of war, but as displaced persons eligible for immigration processing. However, they would need to find American sponsors, secure employment, and obtain housing in communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. It was a more daunting prospect than simply returning to Japan. 5 of the original 14 women decided the uncertainty was too great and chose repatriation. They would return to Japan and face whatever they found there with courage. But 9 women, led by Haruko, Michiko, and Fumiko, chose to accept the challenge of building completely new lives in America. The process of finding sponsors proved easier than anyone expected. The Mitchell family immediately offered to sponsor Haruko, providing housing while she sought employment as a translator. Local hospitals, impressed by her medical background, offered positions. Michiko found work at a textile factory, her attention to detail making her invaluable. Fumiko's administrative skills secured her a position at a school district office. The final repatriation day arrived on September 28, 1945. The scene at Camp Florence was unlike anything in American prisoner of war history. The 38 women who had chosen repatriation carried with them letters from American soldiers, photographs from their time at the camp, and a different understanding of what America represented. Years passed. Haruko became a naturalized citizen in 1952, married a Japanese-American veteran, and raised 3 children while working as a medical translator. Michiko never married, but became a beloved figure in Florence, known for her volunteer work and her bridge between Japanese and American communities. Fumiko eventually earned a college degree and became a teacher. In 1970, Haruko Sato Mitchell stood before a gathering at the United Nations in New York. Now 50 years old with grown children, she had been invited to speak about reconciliation and transformation. She carried with her that same silk pouch she had clutched when she first arrived at Camp Florence 26 years earlier. "We discovered," she told the international audience, "that home isn't just where you come from. It's where you choose to build a life that honors the best in human nature. We found that transformation is possible when people choose to see past hatred to recognize the humanity in their enemies." That choice, made over bowls of hot beef stew on a cold December day, changed everything.